Good afternoon, Faith family. I pray this video finds you well and experiencing the grace of God here in the middle of the week. I have been recently doing a series of videos on how to read the Bible, and we have thought a lot about large, big ideas when it comes to reading the Bible, specifically through thinking about the different contexts of a given passage or verse that you are reading. And so what I thought I would do here in this video and the next few weeks of video is think in particular about a type of literature in the Bible and how to read that particular type of literature. And when I mean literature, I mean something like a poem or something like a letter or something like a gospel. The one I'm thinking about in particular for this video and the next few weeks is narrative or story. We have been studying the book of Genesis now for almost 2 years, and Genesis is full of narratives or stories. And Genesis as a whole is a story, but it is made up of a bunch of smaller stories. Whether it's the entire story of Joseph and the story of Abraham or the story of Noah, or even in the story of Joseph, just the different chapters and scenes that make up the story of Joseph or the particular story of Abraham or the particular story of Noah. And so when we're reading the Bible, we need to think about the story, the narrative, and what makes up a narrative. There's a big word that people use when breaking down scripture or thinking through a particular narrative, and that is the word pericope. Pericope simply means a particular story, a particular narrative, something that in its entirety is a complete story from beginning to end. So let's think about a pericope in the story of Genesis, and in particular in the larger story of Abraham. And I'm thinking here about chapter 22. Genesis 22 is the famous story of Abraham and his test in sacrificing Isaac. Will Abraham sacrifice and give back to God his most beloved and only son Isaac, or will Abraham fail the test and keep Isaac for himself? That is in particular what chapter 22 of Genesis is asking. And Genesis 22 is a pericope. It is a self-contained story from beginning of chapter until almost the end of the chapter about Abraham and God and Isaac. And so one of the things we need to consider when we are trying to understand how to read the Bible is discovering where a pericope or a story begins and a story ends. And in many cases, as we're reading the Bible, there are clues within the Bible itself that help us identify the beginning of a story and the end of the story. Look, for example, here at Genesis 22. Genesis 22 in verse 1 begins with, "After these things, God tested Abraham." That's how verse 1 begins. So after these things is a clear time marker from what came in chapter 21, setting a new setting, setting a new story, setting out a different section of the overall Abraham narrative. But then as you're reading the story, you find in verse 20 these words again. "Now after these things it was told to Abraham." The same words that we discovered back in verse 1. They're kind of an ending phrase, marking off what came before with what now is following. And these words give us a clue to the narrative, to the beginning of the story and the end of the story, which means as we're reading Genesis 22, we're trying to decide, what does the story mean? How can I apply this story and its theological truth to my life? We know that the story begins in verse 1 and the story ends in verse 19. And setting these bars out at the beginning and the end of the story will help us discover the big idea of a narrative and then begin to understand the application of the narrative. So as you're reading narratives, here's my first clue, my first help in how to read the Bible better. Try to discover what is the beginning of a narrative, the beginning of a pericope, and what is the ending or the ending of a narrative, the closing of the pericope. This will help you read the Bible better and find the big idea of a particular story and not blend them and blend our application together. I pray this encourages you on how to read the Bible better for God's glory. Blessings.